The knock came at sunset, when Clara had almost forgotten what hope sounded like. 2 years of silence had taught her that doors only opened to bring bad news, yet something in the stranger's weathered face made her hesitate before turning him away. "Just one favor," Elias Ward said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who rarely asked for anything. She looked into his eyes and saw her own loneliness reflected there, a recognition that cut deeper than any blade. When she nodded yes, neither knew they had just signed their names to destiny's most dangerous contract. The sun hung low over Dry Hollow like a dying ember, casting long shadows across the dusty main street where tumbleweeds gathered against weathered storefronts. Clara Sutton stood at her kitchen window, watching the light fade behind the distant mesa, her hands still damp from washing her son's supper dishes. The silence in her small house had become a living thing, thick and suffocating, broken only by little Tommy's soft breathing from the next room. She had grown accustomed to this hour, the moment when day surrendered to night and loneliness settled over her shoulders like a familiar shawl. 2 years had passed since Samuel's death, 2 years of learning to navigate a world that suddenly felt too large and too empty. The other women in town still brought casseroles and offered sympathetic smiles, but Clara could see the pity in their eyes, the way they looked at her as if she were something broken that might never be whole again. The knock at her door came so unexpectedly that Clara nearly dropped the tin cup she was drying. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she set the cup aside and smoothed her worn apron, wondering who would visit at such an hour. Through the thin curtains, she could make out the silhouette of a tall man, his hat pulled low, his posture speaking of exhaustion and something deeper, a weariness that seemed to emanate from his very bones. Clara hesitated, her hand hovering over the door latch, remembering Samuel's warnings about strangers and the dangers that lurked in the vast emptiness surrounding their small town. But something in the man's stance, the way he waited patiently without knocking again, suggested he was no threat. When she finally opened the door, the evening air rushed in, carrying the scent of sage and dust, and she found herself looking into the most tired eyes she had ever seen. Elias Ward stood on her narrow porch like a man who had forgotten how to ask for help, his weathered hands turning his hat in slow circles. His clothes were travel-stained, his boots caked with the red dirt of the desert, and there was a quality about him that spoke of long distances and longer silences. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from disuse, "I'm sorry to trouble you at this hour." Clara noticed the way he kept his distance, as if he understood that his presence might frighten her, and something in that consideration made her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't name. Behind him, she could see his horse tied to her fence post, the animal favoring its left front leg, its head hanging low with pain. The sight of the injured creature stirred something maternal in Clara, a response that had been dormant since Tommy's birth, and she found herself stepping closer to the doorframe. "My horse threw a shoe about 5 miles back," Elias continued, his gaze never quite meeting hers, instead focusing on some point beyond her shoulder. "Cut his hoof pretty bad on a sharp rock. I was wondering—" He paused, and Clara could see the effort it cost him to form the words, as if asking for help was a language he had forgotten how to speak. "I was wondering if you might have a place where he could rest for the night, just until I can get him to the blacksmith in the morning." The request was simple enough, but Clara could hear the desperation underneath it, the way a man sounds when he's down to his last hope. She looked past him again at the horse, seeing the way the animal's sides heaved with exhaustion, and felt her resolve crumble like sand through her fingers. "Of course," she heard herself saying, the words emerging before her cautious mind could stop them. "There's a small stable behind the house. It's not much, but it's dry and there's hay." Elias's shoulders sagged with relief, and for a moment his careful mask slipped, revealing something raw and grateful underneath. "I can pay you," he said quickly, reaching for his pocket, but Clara shook her head, surprised by her own certainty. "No need for that. Just help me get him settled." As she spoke, she realized it had been months since she had made a decision that felt right, months since she had acted on instinct rather than fear. The evening air seemed to shimmer with possibility, and Clara felt something shift inside her chest, like a door that had been locked for too long finally creaking open. When Elias smiled, a small, hesitant thing that transformed his entire face, Clara felt the ground beneath her feet become suddenly unsteady. "Thank you, Mum," he said, and the simple words carried a weight that seemed to settle directly into her heart. "I'm Clara," she found herself saying, extending her hand in a gesture that felt both natural and terrifying. "Clara Sutton." His hand was warm and calloused when it closed around hers, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, they stood connected by that simple touch while the desert wind whispered secrets around them. In that instant, Clara understood that some favors change everything, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is say yes to a stranger with tired eyes and a wounded horse. The stable behind Clara's house had stood empty since Samuel's death, its wooden walls weathered silver by 2 years of neglect and desert storms. As she led Elias through the narrow gate, Clara felt the weight of memories pressing against her chest. Samuel's gentle hands caring for their old mare, the sound of his voice humming while he worked, the way he had always known exactly what each animal needed. Now, watching Elias guide his limping horse into the dim interior, she realized how much she had missed the simple presence of someone who understood the quiet language of wounded things. The stranger moved with careful precision, his hands gentle as he examined the horse's injured hoof, and Clara found herself studying the way his shoulders curved protectively over the animal, the way he murmured soft words that seemed to calm both horse and handler. "He's a good horse," Elias said quietly, running his palm along the animal's neck. "Carried me through 3 states without complaint. Guess I pushed him too hard." There was something in his voice that suggested he was talking about more than just the journey, and Clara felt a familiar ache of recognition. She had spent 2 years pushing herself too hard, trying to be strong enough for Tommy, strong enough to face each day, without Samuel's steady presence beside her. "What's his name?" she asked, stepping closer to stroke the horse's velvet nose, surprised by how natural the gesture felt. "Thunder," Elias replied, and Clara could hear the affection in his voice, though he's been more like a whisper lately. The joke was small and sad, but it made Clara smile for the first time in weeks, and she saw something flicker in Elias's eyes when he noticed. As they worked together to make Thunder comfortable, Clara became aware of the easy rhythm that developed between them. The way Elias anticipated her movements, how he stepped back when she needed space, the careful dance of 2 people who had both learned to be alone. When she brought fresh water from the well, he was already spreading hay in the corner, and when he needed clean rags for the horse's wound, she appeared with strips torn from an old sheet. The silence between them wasn't empty like the silence in her house. It was full of shared purpose and unspoken understanding. Clara found herself watching Elias's hands as he cleaned Thunder's hoof, noting the gentleness in his touch, the patience in his movements, and feeling something warm unfurl in her chest, like a flower that had been waiting for spring. "You're good with animals," Clara observed, settling onto an overturned bucket while Elias finished his ministrations. The compliment seemed to surprise him, and she saw color rise in his weathered cheeks. "Had to be," he said simply. "Been just me and Thunder for a long time now." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications, and Clara felt her heart skip in recognition of a kindred spirit. "How long?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she had the right to such a personal question. Elias was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer, but then he straightened and met her eyes directly for the first time. 3 years, he said, "since my wife died." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that seemed to touch every corner of the small stable. Clara felt her breath catch, not just at the revelation, but at the way Elias had shared it, simply, without self-pity, as if he were stating a fact about the weather. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and meant it with every fibre of her being. 2 years for me, she found herself adding, though she hadn't planned to share her own grief with this stranger. But somehow, in the golden light filtering through the stable's dusty windows, Elias didn't feel like a stranger anymore. He felt like someone who would understand the weight of empty beds and silent dinners, the way grief could make you feel like you were drowning in plain sight. "Samuel was thrown from a horse," she continued, surprised by her own need to speak his name aloud. "Broke his neck, gone before the doctor could even—" Her voice cracked, and she pressed her lips together, fighting the tears that still came too easily. Elias moved closer, not touching, but near enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. "The worst part," he said quietly, "is how the world just keeps going, like nothing happened, like they were never here at all." Clara looked up at him through her tears and saw her own pain reflected in his dark eyes, and suddenly the stable felt like a sanctuary where broken people could speak the truth without fear of judgment. "Yes," she breathed, and in that single word was all the loneliness and confusion and desperate hope she had carried for 2 long years. When Elias reached out and gently touched her hand, Clara didn't pull away. And for the first time since Samuel's death, she didn't feel completely alone in the world. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty yard as Clara watched Elias tend to his horse with the same gentle precision he had shown her wounded heart. His hands moved with practiced care along the animal's injured leg, and she found herself studying the way his shoulders curved protectively over the creature, the same way he had curved over her fears the night before. The silence between them had shifted from awkward to comfortable, like an old quilt that had finally found its proper place. When he looked up and caught her watching, neither of them looked away, and Clara felt something dangerous and beautiful stirring in the space between what was and what could be. The morning air carried the scent of sage and possibility, and for the first time in 2 years, Clara allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't taste like ash. As Elias straightened and walked toward her, his boots creating small clouds of dust with each step, Clara realized that some promises didn't need words to be made. The kitchen felt smaller, with Elias sitting at her table, his large frame making the simple wooden chairs seem fragile and inadequate. Clara poured coffee with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the strange electricity that seemed to dance in the air whenever he was near. Tommy sat beside Elias, chattering about horses and adventures with the easy trust that children possessed, and Clara watched as this quiet man listened with genuine interest to her son's endless questions. There was something achingly beautiful about seeing Elias's weathered face soften as Tommy described his dreams of riding across the desert, and Clara felt her heart crack open just a little wider. The morning light streaming through the window caught the silver threads in Elias's dark hair, and Clara found herself wondering what it would feel like to run her fingers through those strands. When Elias caught her staring again, he didn't smile, but something warm and patient flickered in his eyes, as if he understood that healing took time and he was willing to wait. The afternoon brought unexpected rain, a rare gift in the desert that sent Tommy running outside to dance in the precious drops, while Clara and Elias watched from the covered porch. The sound of water hitting the dry earth created a symphony that seemed to wash away the dust of old sorrows, and Clara felt herself breathing deeper than she had in months. Elias stood close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, and when a particularly strong gust of wind sent rain droplets across the porch, he instinctively stepped closer to shield her. The gesture was so natural, so protective, that Clara felt tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks, though she couldn't say if they were tears of grief or gratitude. When Tommy called for them to join him in the rain, Elias looked at Clara with a question in his eyes, and without thinking, she took his offered hand and stepped into the storm. As the 3 of them stood together in the cleansing downpour, Clara felt the last of her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. The evening meal was a quiet affair, but the silence was filled with glances and small gestures that spoke louder than words ever could. Elias helped clear the table without being asked, his movements careful and respectful in her domestic space, and Clara found herself imagining how natural it would feel to have him there every evening. Tommy had fallen asleep in his chair, exhausted from his rain dance, and when Elias gently lifted the boy and carried him to his bed, Clara followed, watching as this strong man tucked her son in with the tenderness of someone who understood the preciousness of childhood. Standing in the doorway of Tommy's room, watching Elias smooth the blanket over her sleeping child, Clara felt something shift permanently in her chest, like a door that had been locked for 2 years, finally swinging open. When Elias turned and found her watching, the look that passed between them was so intense, so full of unspoken longing, that Clara had to grip the doorframe to keep from swaying. As they walked back to the kitchen together, their shoulders brushing in the narrow hallway, Clara knew that whatever was happening between them had moved far beyond a simple favor. The night stretched before them like an uncharted territory, full of possibilities and dangers that neither of them had the courage to name. They sat on the porch steps, the desert air cooling around them, and Clara found herself telling Elias about Samuel, about the way grief had hollowed her out until she felt like a ghost haunting her own life. Elias listened without judgment, his presence steady and grounding, and when she finished speaking, he told her about his own losses, about the ranch he had lost and the dreams that had died with it. Their stories wove together in the darkness, creating a tapestry of shared pain and understanding that felt more intimate than any physical touch. When a coyote howled in the distance, Clara instinctively moved closer to Elias, and when his arm came around her shoulders, she didn't resist the comfort he offered. They sat like that until the stars emerged, two broken people finding wholeness in each other's company, and Clara realized that sometimes healing came not from forgetting the past, but from finding someone willing to help carry its weight. As the night deepened and the desert settled into its ancient rhythm, Clara felt the last of her resistance melting away like snow in the spring sun, leaving behind something tender and new and terrifyingly hopeful. Dawn arrived with the harsh reality that Elias's horse was healing faster than either of them had expected, and Clara found herself moving through her morning routine with the desperate efficiency of someone trying to slow time itself. She lingered over breakfast preparations, taking twice as long as usual to slice bread and brew coffee, while Elias sat at her table with the patient stillness of a man who understood that some things couldn't be rushed. Tommy chattered between them, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension that crackled like lightning before a storm, and Clara caught herself memorizing the way Elias's eyes crinkled when he smiled at her son's stories. The kitchen felt charged with unspoken words and unfulfilled promises, and Clara realized that she was falling in love with the quiet spaces between Elias's sentences, the way he listened with his whole body, the careful respect he showed for her grief, even as he offered her hope. When he mentioned that his horse might be ready to travel by tomorrow, Clara felt something cold and desperate claw at her chest, and she turned away to hide the panic that must have been written across her face. The morning sun streaming through the window seemed suddenly harsh and unforgiving, illuminating all the reasons why she should let him go and none of the reasons why she wanted him to stay. The day passed in a blur of ordinary moments that felt extraordinary simply because they were shared, and Clara found herself cataloguing each gesture, each glance, each accidental touch, as if she were creating a treasure map of memories to sustain her through the loneliness that would surely follow. Elias helped her hang laundry on the line, his large hands surprisingly gentle with her delicate things, and Clara felt her breath catch when his fingers brushed hers as they reached for the same clothespin. They worked in comfortable silence, the desert wind whipping the sheets around them like white flags of surrender, and Clara wondered if he could feel the electricity that seemed to spark every time they came near each other. When Tommy napped in the afternoon heat, Clara and Elias sat on the porch, ostensibly watching the horizon, but really watching each other. And Clara felt the weight of all the things they weren't saying pressing down on her chest like a physical force. The silence between them had become a living thing, full of longing and fear and the terrible knowledge that some moments were too precious to last. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Clara realized that she was memorizing the way the light caught the planes of Elias's face, storing up images against the famine of loneliness that awaited her. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Mrs. Henderson from town, a well-meaning woman whose eyes missed nothing and whose tongue wagged faster than a dog's tail in summer. She bustled into Clara's kitchen with the proprietary air of someone who considered herself the unofficial guardian of local morality, and Clara watched with growing dread as the woman's sharp gaze took in Elias's presence, the extra coffee cup on the table, the unmistakable intimacy that had settled over the small house like morning mist. Mrs. Henderson's questions came rapid fire, each one designed to extract maximum information with minimum effort, and Clara felt herself shrinking under the weight of implied judgment and small-town scrutiny. Elias, to his credit, answered politely but briefly, his natural reserve serving as armor against the woman's invasive curiosity, but Clara could see the way his shoulders tensed, the way his eyes grew distant and careful. When Mrs. Henderson finally left, trailing warnings about propriety and reputation behind her like smoke from a poorly tended fire, Clara felt the fragile bubble of possibility that had surrounded them for 3 days burst with an almost audible pop. The silence that followed was different from their comfortable quiet, heavy with the weight of social expectations and the cruel reality of a world that would judge a widow for daring to hope again. The evening meal was subdued, the easy conversation of previous days replaced by careful politeness that felt like a step backward into the formal distance they had worked so hard to bridge. Tommy sensed the change in atmosphere with the intuitive wisdom of children, growing quiet and clingy in a way that made Clara's heart ache with guilt and uncertainty. Elias helped with the dishes as he had before, but his movements were more careful now, more conscious of propriety, and Clara felt the space between them widening like a chasm that she didn't know how to cross. When he mentioned again that his horse would be ready to travel tomorrow, his voice was gentle but final, and Clara nodded with a composure that cost her everything she had left. The kitchen that had felt warm and alive with possibility now seemed cold and empty, despite the fact that he was still there, still close enough to touch if she had the courage to reach out. As they moved through the familiar routine of cleaning up, Clara felt like she was already practicing for the loneliness that would return with the morning sun, and the weight of that knowledge settled over her like a shroud. The night air carried the scent of rain again, but this time the approaching storm felt ominous rather than cleansing, and Clara stood on the porch, watching lightning flicker on the distant horizon while Elias checked on his horse one final time. When he returned, his face was carefully neutral, but Clara could see the conflict in his eyes, the same battle between duty and desire that was tearing her apart from the inside. They sat together on the porch steps, as they had the night before, but the easy intimacy was gone, replaced by the terrible politeness of two people who had glimpsed paradise and been reminded that it wasn't meant for them. When Elias finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he was trying to hide, and he told her that he had to leave, that staying would only make things harder for both of them, that a woman like her deserved better than a broken-down rancher with nothing to offer but empty hands and a heart full of old wounds. Clara listened to his careful words and heard all the things he wasn't saying, all the love he was trying to protect her from, and she felt something fierce and desperate rise up in her chest like a wildfire that refused to be contained. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Clara made a decision that would change everything, her voice cutting through the darkness with the clarity of a woman who had finally found the courage to fight for what she wanted, even if it meant risking everything she had left to lose. The rain began in earnest as Clara turned to face Elias, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. And in the flickering light of the approaching storm, she saw her own longing reflected in his eyes. The words came tumbling out before she could stop them, raw and honest and terrifying in their simplicity. She didn't care what Mrs. Henderson thought, didn't care what the town would say, didn't care about anything except the fact that for the first time in 2 years she felt alive again, and she wasn't ready to go back to being a ghost in her own life. Elias stared at her as if she had just offered him salvation and damnation in the same breath, his weathered hands clenching and unclenching as he fought some internal battle that she could see playing out across his features like shadows on a wall. The rain was coming harder now, driving them toward the shelter of the house, but neither of them moved, both frozen in the space between what was safe and what was possible. When lightning illuminated the sky, Clara saw the exact moment when Elias's careful control cracked, saw the love he had been trying to hide spill across his face like water through a broken dam. As thunder rolled across the desert, he reached for her with hands that trembled, and Clara stepped into his embrace with the desperate relief of someone who had been drowning and finally found solid ground. The storm raged outside while they stood in her kitchen, dripping and breathless and staring at each other with the wonder of people who had just discovered they were not alone in the world after all. Elias's hands framed her face with a gentleness that made Clara want to weep, his thumbs tracing the tracks of rainwater and tears on her cheeks as if he were memorizing the geography of her hope. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion and disbelief, telling her that he had nothing to offer except a heart that had been broken too many times and hands that knew more about loss than love. But Clara silenced him with a kiss that tasted like rain and redemption, and the courage to believe in second chances. The kiss deepened as the storm outside reached its crescendo, and Clara felt herself melting into this man who had appeared at her door, asking for a simple favor, and ended up offering her the world. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard and staring at each other with something approaching awe, Clara knew that there was no going back, that whatever happened next, she had chosen love over fear, hope over safety, and the terrifying possibility of happiness over the familiar comfort of grief. The morning after the storm dawned clear and bright, the desert washed clean and sparkling with possibility, and Clara woke with the strange sensation that she had been reborn during the night. Elias was already up, moving quietly around her kitchen as if he belonged there, and when he turned to smile at her, Clara felt her heart perform some impossible acrobatic feat in her chest. Tommy bounded into the kitchen with the boundless energy of childhood, chattering excitedly about the storm and the way the rain had turned the dusty yard into a temporary lake, and Clara watched with amazement as Elias scooped her son up and spun him around, both of them laughing with pure joy. The scene was so perfect, so exactly what she had dreamed of during her loneliest nights, that Clara had to grip the doorframe to keep from floating away on a cloud of happiness. When Elias set Tommy down and caught Clara's eye, the look that passed between them was full of promises and possibilities, and Clara realized that sometimes the most important decisions were made not with careful planning, but with the wild courage of a heart that refused to be denied. As she moved to join them at the table, Clara felt the last of her old life falling away, like a snake shedding its skin, leaving behind something new and bright and impossibly hopeful. The day passed in a blur of practical preparations and emotional revelations, as Clara and Elias navigated the strange territory of building a life together from the fragments of their separate sorrows. They talked about everything and nothing, their conversation weaving between the mundane details of daily existence and the profound questions of what it meant to love again after loss. Elias spoke of his dreams for a new ranch, a place where he could build something lasting and beautiful, and Clara found herself imagining Tommy growing up with horses and wide open spaces, learning about strength and gentleness from a man who embodied both. When the subject of marriage arose, it was with the natural inevitability of sunrise, not a question of if, but when. And Clara felt a thrill of terror and excitement that made her feel more alive than she had in years. They made plans with the careful attention of people who had learned not to take happiness for granted, discussing everything from where they would live to how they would handle the inevitable gossip that would follow their unconventional courtship. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Clara realized that she was no longer afraid of tomorrow, no longer haunted by the ghosts of yesterday, but fully present in the miraculous reality of today. The evening brought a sense of completion that felt almost sacred, as if the universe had finally aligned to bring them to this moment of perfect understanding. They sat on the porch as they had every night since Elias arrived, but this time there was no tension, no unspoken longing, only the deep contentment of two people who had found their way home to each other. Tommy fell asleep between them, his small body warm and trusting, and Clara felt the rightness of it settle into her bones like a blessing. When Elias spoke of leaving in the morning to make arrangements for their future, Clara no longer felt the panic that had gripped her before, because she knew with absolute certainty that he would return, that they had crossed some invisible threshold from which there was no retreat. The stars emerged one by one in the vast desert sky, and Clara thought about how different this night was from the one just a week ago when she had been alone with her grief and her fears, never imagining that a simple favor could transform her entire world. As Elias's arm tightened around her and Tommy stirred sleepily against her side, Clara felt the profound peace that came from knowing she was exactly where she belonged. The night air carried the promise of new beginnings, as Clara looked up at the man who had asked for just one favor and ended up giving her everything she had never dared to hope for, and in the gentle pressure of his hand in hers, she felt the future unfolding like a flower blooming in the desert after rain.